Welcome to Books Under Your Bed. I'm Wilson McCraw. Today I'm going to talk about some horror short fiction by Clive Barker that was collected in Books of Blood. These stories were written in 1982-83, released in 1984. Around this time, Clive Barker was writing and directing, producing plays in the UK. I think the most famous one is probably History of the Devil. And around that time, shortly after university, he read a collection of horror short stories called Dark Forces. It collected pretty much all the major famous horror writers of the time, Stephen King, etc. And it inspired him to want to write his own collection of short stories that were equally as varied as Dark Forces. So part of his goal with Books of Blood was to have a collective types of horror. So comedic horror, erotic horror, gory, intense horror, all collected in the same volume. I think what's interesting about that approach is that even though this was the start of Clive Barker's career, and even though he switched up the styles for each short story, he still has a very distinct Clive Barker authoritative voice to his writing that stands out. The first story I wanted to highlight is The Midnight Meat Train. It's the most scary, visceral story of the first book. It takes place in New York City. It's very much about New York City and kind of the moral sacrifice that humanity makes to have prosperous cities. It also takes place mostly in the subway, thus the Midnight Meat Train, because the subway is used as a sort of slaughterhouse. The main character of the story falls asleep on the subway, and when he wakes up, he realizes that his fellow passengers have been stripped and hung up and skinned. And then it intensifies from there. I love the story. I love how the story is resolved. It was adapted into a movie that's not nearly as good as the story itself. Part of why the movie failed, I think, is that it tries to set up a series of movies, which never happened because the first one wasn't that successful. But also it moves the story from New York City to LA, and the LA subway system just isn't as iconic as the New York subway system, so it sort of undermines the whole idea of the story. The next story I'd like to highlight is the Yattering and Jack. This was definitely one of my favorites when I first read it. It is the most humorous story in the collection. It's about a demon who is trying to torment a human, but the human is oblivious and won't really react to anything the Yattering does, no matter how outlandish the demon's things that he tries to torment the human character with. The human character is like, it's just sort of writes it off as random happenstance. It was also adapted into other mediums. There's a comic book, there's an episode of a television show, but part of the fun of the Yattering and Jack is how it's told, the language that is used from the demon's perspective. So if you want a fun horror story, that one's a definite highlight. The third story I'd like to highlight is In the Hills, the City. This one definitely stood out to a lot of readers as one of the most original concepts of the Books of Blood. It is about two gay characters that are traveling, I believe, in Yugoslavia on a vacation. and they stumble upon a city ritual, which is a very kind of common setup for like folk horror. But this ritual is different than any folk cult stuff that you've ever experienced in a short story. I think it's vast and grand, and I can understand why it hasn't been adapted yet. Uh, I'll leave that as sort of a mysterious tease, and hopefully you'll read the story yourself. The final story that I'd like to highlight is actually in the second volume. It's, I think, the first story. It's called Dread. Dread was also adapted into a movie, and it's yet another story where I think it works better as a story than as a movie. But mainly it's about a scientist, researcher who's has like this deep-seated fear of clowns, and he wants to research other people's fears and phobias. And so he goes to extremes to waylay his fears. I won't say too much more about the story, so I don't spoil it, but I was very satisfied with the ending. Hopefully some of those descriptions of these stories piqued your interest. I definitely think that Books of Blood was a very influential work that still stands up today after 40 years. A note about its reception. Like I said, it was published in 1984. It did okay when it first came out. It sold slowly, but with slowly gathering more and more fans. And then it blew up after Stephen King read it and talked about it. I'd like to quote Stephen King about it, if I can. Let's see. He wrote this in April 1985. I think Clive Barker is so good that I'm almost literally tongue-tied. Yes, I stick by it. I've seen the future of the horror genre, and his name is Clive Barker. What Barker does in the Books of Blood makes the rest of us look like we've been asleep for the past 10 years. I don't think I can give it a better recommendation than that, so I'll leave it there.